I want my $25,000 now. Pay up or I'm selling this.
Mom, please, I don't have it.
Then your car goes to auction.
My mother slid a printed invoice across our kitchen table, $25,000 in retroactive unpaid rent. For the past 4 years I'd lived at home while building my career, informing me flatly that if I didn't produce that amount within the week, she intended to have my car towed and auctioned to cover what I supposedly owed. I sat there staring at that invoice, genuinely stunned, understanding immediately this wasn't really about rent at all. Stick with me because exactly 1 week later, my mother and stepfather were calling me in genuine desperation, begging me to come back, and the reason why revealed exactly how much they'd actually been depending on me all along. I remember staring at that carefully typed document, formatted almost professionally with a line item breakdown by month, feeling a strange, disorienting mixture of hurt and disbelief settle through my entire body. 4 years she'd written at approximately $520 monthly, a number she'd apparently pulled from some vague sense of what market rent should have been rather than anything resembling an actual, previously agreed arrangement between us. My name is Talia Sedgeworth. I'm 26 years old, and I'd lived with my mother, Delia, and my stepfather, Gordon, for the past 4 years while building my career as a dental hygienist, an arrangement I'd always understood as mutually beneficial rather than any kind of formal tenancy requiring rent, given how much unpaid household labor and financial contribution I'd actually provided throughout those years. That invoice arrived entirely without warning, delivered the same week I'd finally saved enough to seriously consider moving into my own apartment, a timing that felt, even in that first stunned moment, considerably too calculated to represent genuine coincidence. I remember asking her directly, my voice still carrying genuine shock, whether this represented some kind of joke, and watching her expression remain entirely, unsettlingly serious throughout her response. Throughout those 4 years living at home, I'd never paid formal rent, but I'd contributed substantially in other ways, covering our household's grocery bills most months, paying for internet and streaming services, covering my younger stepbrother Milo's school supplies and extracurricular fees whenever money ran tight, and handling considerable household management my mother and Gordon had gradually, quietly come to depend on. I'd taken on the grocery shopping almost entirely by my second year living there, initially just picking up a few extra items during my own trips but eventually, without any explicit discussion, becoming the person who handled our household's entire weekly shopping list. I'd also covered several $1,000s in unexpected home repairs over those years, a broken water heater, a necessary roof patch, expenses my mother and Gordon genuinely couldn't have covered independently given their own limited, inconsistent income from Gordon's small landscaping business. I remember the water heater specifically, a nearly $1,100 repair I'd covered without a second thought at the time, genuinely glad to help ensure our household had reliable hot water, never once imagining that contribution might someday be entirely erased from whatever calculation my mother eventually decided to present me with. I calculated, once I finally sat down and genuinely tallied everything, that my actual financial contributions throughout those 4 years likely exceeded whatever reasonable rent might have totaled, making that sudden $25,000 demand feel considerably more like calculated extraction than any legitimate, overdue payment. I spent nearly 2 hours that evening reviewing old bank statements and receipts, watching the actual total climb past $20,000 in grocery and utility contributions alone, before I even factored in the various repairs and Milo's school expenses I'd quietly covered throughout those years. I learned, through a conversation with Milo shortly after receiving that invoice, additional context regarding exactly why my mother had apparently decided this specific moment represented the right time to demand such a significant sum. Gordon's landscaping business had lost a major client roughly 2 months earlier, creating genuine financial strain my mother had apparently decided to address by extracting a lump sum from me, rather than having an honest conversation about our household's actual finances. "She's been stressed about money for weeks," Milo told me quietly, sitting on the edge of my bed while I packed a box of books, glancing occasionally toward the closed door as though worried our mother might overhear. "I think she just panicked and decided this was the easiest way to get a bunch of cash fast." He mentioned overhearing a tense conversation between our mother and Gordon a few nights earlier, one where Gordon had suggested, almost offhandedly, that I probably had savings just sitting there given how responsible I'd always been with money. I recognized, processing this information, that my mother's calculated demand reflected genuine desperation rather than any legitimate grievance regarding years of supposedly unpaid rent, desperation she'd apparently decided to address through pressure and threat rather than honest, direct conversation about our family's actual financial situation. It struck me, sitting there with Milo, that this entire situation could have unfolded so differently had she simply come to me directly, honestly, and asked whether I might be willing to help during a difficult stretch, rather than constructing an elaborate, backdated invoice designed specifically to make her request feel like a legitimate debt rather than the desperate ask it actually represented. I decided, rather than attempting to negotiate or explain my actual contributions, to simply comply with my mother's implicit suggestion and move out entirely, packing my belongings over that following weekend and relocating to the apartment I'd already been quietly planning to eventually secure. I remember the specific strange calm I felt throughout that entire moving process, understanding clearly that whatever relationship my mother believed she was protecting through that calculated demand had already revealed itself as considerably more transactional than I'd ever previously wanted to acknowledge. I moved through that weekend almost mechanically, sorting through years of accumulated belongings, discovering, tucked away in a closet, old photographs from childhood that made the entire situation feel even more genuinely surreal, evidence of a closeness that felt increasingly disconnected from whatever calculated arrangement our relationship had apparently quietly become. I left without dramatic confrontation, simply informing my mother that I'd be moving out by the end of the week, understanding that continuing to live under a roof where my own presence had apparently been quietly resented and calculated against represented something I no longer genuinely wanted to maintain, regardless of whatever financial demand had originally prompted this specific realization. She said very little as I carried boxes past her in the hallway, her silence carrying its own particular weight, though I couldn't tell, in that specific moment, whether it reflected genuine regret or simply stunned surprise that I'd actually chosen to leave rather than scrambling to somehow produce the money she'd demanded. I settled into my new apartment that following week, genuinely relieved despite the sudden, significant transition, finding a particular satisfaction in finally having a space entirely my own, free from whatever calculated financial pressure had apparently been quietly building within my mother's household throughout recent months. I maintained minimal contact with my mother and Gordon throughout those first several days, processing my own complicated emotions regarding everything that had happened, while also genuinely enjoying the independence my new living situation provided. I remember arranging my few pieces of furniture that first weekend, a second-hand couch and a small kitchen table I'd found through a local listing, feeling a genuine, quiet pride in building something entirely my own, however modest, without any complicated family dynamic attached to it. I heard from Milo again roughly 4 days after moving out, his voice carrying genuine distress as he described the household's rapidly deteriorating situation without my previously invisible financial contributions. The internet had been disconnected due to unpaid bills, groceries had grown noticeably sparse, and tension between our mother and Gordon had escalated considerably given their own mounting financial strain. "It's honestly kind of a mess here," he admitted. "I didn't realize how much you were actually covering until it all just kind of stopped happening." My mother called me directly exactly 1 week after that original ultimatum, her voice carrying a considerably different tone than the calculated demand she delivered across our kitchen table just 7 days earlier. "Talia, honey, I think we need to talk," she said. "Things have gotten really difficult here, and I miss having you around." I listened carefully, recognizing immediately that this call reflected genuine desperation regarding the household's rapidly deteriorating financial situation rather than any authentic reconsideration of how she'd originally treated me. "What exactly has gotten difficult?" I asked, genuinely curious how she intended to frame this specific conversation. She admitted with visible reluctance that several bills had gone unpaid, that Gordon's business troubles had grown considerably more serious, and that our household's finances had essentially collapsed without my previously consistent, if largely invisible, contributions throughout those preceding years. I could hear genuine strain in her voice throughout that entire call, a strain that felt considerably different from the calculated, businesslike tone she'd used delivering that original invoice just a week earlier. "I know I handled things badly," she added, though her apology felt, even in that moment, somewhat incomplete, focused more on the practical consequences of my absence than any genuine acknowledgement of how unfairly she'd originally treated me. Gordon called me directly the following day, His own request considerably more transparent than my mother's earlier, softer approach. "We really need you to come back," he said. "Things just aren't working without your help covering groceries and the internet and everything else you used to handle." I recognized clearly, throughout that specific conversation, that their genuine desire wasn't for my actual presence or relationship, but rather for the practical financial stability I'd apparently provided throughout those preceding years without either of them ever genuinely acknowledging its actual significance until it disappeared entirely. Gordon's voice carried a particular kind of frustration throughout that call, less genuine concern for my own well-being and considerably more focused on the specific, immediate inconveniences my absence had generated within their daily household routine. I remember standing in my own kitchen while he spoke, genuinely struck by how quickly the conversation moved from a vague opening about missing me toward a fairly detailed list of exactly which bills had gone unpaid, and which specific tasks nobody else in the household seemed capable of managing. "You demanded $25,000 from me a week ago," I reminded him. "Now you're asking me to just come back and keep contributing the way I always did? That doesn't really add up, Gordon." He stumbled through an explanation that revealed, with unintentional clarity, exactly how thoroughly he and my mother had apparently never genuinely valued my contributions as anything beyond a convenient, expected resource, one they'd assumed would simply remain available regardless of how they chose to treat me. "I mean, we obviously went about that whole thing wrong," he said. "But we really are struggling here without you." I asked him directly whether he genuinely considered, even briefly, what it might feel like to receive that kind of ultimatum from people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, and the extended silence that followed told me, more clearly than any words could have, that he genuinely hadn't. I agreed to meet with my mother directly, wanting a genuine, honest conversation rather than continuing to navigate this situation through indirect calls and vague requests. "I need you to understand something," I told her. "That invoice wasn't really about unpaid rent. It was about you panicking over Gordon's business troubles and deciding I was an easy source of quick cash, without ever considering everything I'd actually already been contributing for years." My mother's response carried genuine, if belated, acknowledgement. "I think I convinced myself the invoice was fair because I was so stressed about money," she admitted. "I didn't really think through how unfair it actually was, or how much you'd genuinely already been helping us all along." I watched her fidget with her coffee cup throughout that conversation, clearly uncomfortable but, for the first time since this entire situation began, genuinely present rather than defensive. I told her clearly that I wasn't interested in simply returning to our previous arrangement, where my own significant contributions remained largely invisible and unacknowledged until convenient for someone else to calculate against me. "I'm not saying I don't want a relationship with you," I clarified. "I'm saying I need that relationship to actually reflect honesty about what I contribute and what's genuinely expected of me, not just whatever version happens to be convenient for you in any given moment." I offered my mother a considerably different arrangement going forward. I would remain in my own apartment, maintaining my own independence, while offering modest, clearly defined financial help during genuine emergencies, help extended through honest conversation rather than any unspoken assumption or calculated pressure. We sat down together and actually wrote out, in plain language, exactly what kind of support felt reasonable going forward, a document that felt considerably more honest than the calculated invoice that had originally started this entire painful process. I made clear that this modest support would never again function as the kind of invisible, unacknowledged household backbone I'd apparently provided throughout those previous 4 years. Support I now understood had never been genuinely appreciated until its sudden absence made its actual value undeniable. I explained to her as clearly as I could that genuine appreciation looks like acknowledgement offered freely, not gratitude that only surfaces once someone realizes exactly how much they'd been quietly losing. My mother accepted these new terms, though our relationship remained genuinely more careful and boundaried throughout the following months than it had ever been during those earlier years I'd lived at home. Gordon, for his part, seemed to genuinely internalize the lesson considerably more slowly than my mother did, occasionally slipping back into language that suggested he still viewed my past contributions as simply expected rather than genuinely appreciated, moments that required me to gently but firmly reinforce the boundaries we'd all agreed to establish together. Standing in my own apartment roughly 6 months after that devastating original ultimatum, genuinely settled into an independent life I'd built entirely on my own clear, honest terms, I thought often about that printed invoice and everything it had ultimately revealed about my actual place within my mother's household. I remember specifically the evening I finally unpacked my last box in that new apartment, standing in my own small kitchen, genuinely proud of the modest but entirely self-sufficient life I'd managed to build in such a short amount of time. There was a particular satisfaction in knowing that everything within those walls existed because of my own effort, my own careful budgeting, my own decisions, rather than any arrangement someone else could suddenly, unilaterally recalculate against me whenever their own circumstances grew difficult. I'd learned throughout that entire process that genuine family support requires honest acknowledgement and mutual respect, not the kind of quiet, unexamined dependence that only reveals its own true value once it's finally undeniably removed. I think often about how easily that entire dynamic could have continued indefinitely had my mother never sent that invoice. How many more years I might have quietly absorbed increasing responsibility without anyone genuinely acknowledging its actual weight or value. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from watching someone's true priorities reveal themselves so plainly, a clarity I've come to be genuinely grateful for, however painful it felt receiving it in that specific, calculated form. My relationship with Milo remained genuinely close throughout that entire transition, his own perspective on our family's dynamics considerably more clear-eyed than either of our parents seemed to manage, and I found myself grateful throughout those months for having at least one person within that household who genuinely saw and appreciated what I'd actually been contributing all along. We started getting lunch together every couple of weeks, something we'd never really done consistently when I still lived at home, conversations that felt genuinely lighter and more honest than most of what I'd exchanged with our mother throughout those preceding years. I don't regret leaving that week, understanding clearly that sometimes the most important thing you can do for yourself is simply refuse to remain somewhere your own genuine contributions were never actually seen clearly until you were finally, completely gone. I think sometimes about that printed invoice sitting somewhere in a drawer at my mother's house, a document that was meant to control and diminish me, but that instead became the exact catalyst I needed to finally recognize my own worth clearly enough to build a life that reflected it honestly. I've thought, too, about how differently things might have unfolded had I simply panicked in that first moment, scrambling to somehow produce $25,000 rather than allowing myself the clarity to walk away entirely. There's a particular kind of strength I've come to understand in refusing to be rushed into someone else's version of urgency, especially when that urgency has been manufactured specifically to extract something from you that was never legitimately owed in the first place. My car, the very thing my mother had threatened to auction off that afternoon, still sits parked outside my own apartment now, a small quiet reminder of exactly how much was actually at stake in that specific moment, and exactly how much I ultimately gained by refusing to let fear make that decision for me.